Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Today, we're digging into some recent happenings in Brazilian politics.
Yeah, we're guided by this really interesting collection of analysis and clips from a political commentator. They've pulled together points from various news reports, public statements.
Exactly. And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to unpack the narrative that's presented in this source material.
Which seems to focus on, well, power dynamics, maybe some alleged tensions.
That's right. And conflicting approaches within the government, sort of zeroing in on the relationship between President Lula and his finance minister, Fernando Haddad.
Okay, so let's get into this narrative. The source kicks things off with a public event, right? Featuring the politician Renan Filho.
And the source really highlights what he said in his speech there.
Which was what, basically?
Well, according to the source, it was extensive praise for President Lula. Lots of claims about big federal investments happening down in Santa Catarina state.
Ah, okay. And the source mentions he listed specific things, like infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. Highway projects, the BR-470, BR-280, BR-163, those key federal routes.
Right.
Plus mentions of things like Minha Casa Minha Vida, the housing program.
The federal one, yeah.
Education funding, investments in the Port of Itagi, and even the piecemeal student aid program.
So the source presents this as Renan Filho saying, look at all these great things happening thanks to the federal government.
Pretty much, framing them as life-changing investments. But here's where the source introduces a contrast.
Okay.
It talks about Lula's reaction during the speech, reporting that the president seemed, well, maybe indifferent, not fully paying attention.
And the commentator, the source we're drawing on, how did they read that moment?
They were pretty direct. They interpreted this whole interaction, the big praise and the alleged indifference, as a significant display of, well, they use the word sycophancy.
Strong word.
Yeah. And the source then questions, the actual substance behind those investment claims being made, especially given the president's supposed lack of attention.
So the source is kind of setting up this idea of a gap between public political displays and maybe the underlying reality, or at least the leader's focus.
That seems to be the angle, yeah, highlighting that difference.
Okay, so moving from that public scene, the sources then shift focus. They talk about a report from GloboNews, right?
That's right, included in the material we have. It takes us to a private gathering, a barbecue.
Hosted by Hugo Motta. He's the president of the Chamber of Deputies.
Correct. Described as a petit comité, a small select group.
And the guest list, according to the report the source uses, was seen as, well, significant.
Very much so. President Lula was reportedly there, and so was Gabriel Galípolo, who's the president of the central bank.
Okay, Lula and Galípolo. But the source makes a point about who wasn't there.
Exactly. Notably absent, according to the report, Finance Minister Fernando Haddad.
And political observers, the ones cited by our source, they read something into that.
They definitely did. It wasn't just seen as a random dinner list. The fact that Lula and Galípolo were there, the apparent closeness described, it was interpreted as a potential signal.
A signal of what?
That Lula is, or is seen to be, aligning himself more closely with Galípolo.
Especially, the source suggests, on a specific issue.
Yeah, the debate around possibly increasing the IOF, the tax on financial operations.
Right, that tax on financial transactions. Galípolo was reportedly against hiking that specific tax.
That's what the source indicates. So the interpretation presented is that Lula attending this meeting, seemingly close to Galípolo, might suggest he's leaning towards Galípolo's stance on the IOF.
Effectively undercutting Haddad, perhaps, since Haddad's ministry would usually handle that kind of fiscal proposal.
That's the dynamic the source points to, where maybe personal trust or these informal channels seem to be influencing things alongside the formal roles. It's a common theme in politics, really.
It definitely shows the complexity. And wasn't there another anecdote in the source material supporting this idea about where Lula gets economic info?
Yes, there was. A detail about Lula apparently sharing some notes from Gabriel Galípolo about a specific economic sector.
Sharing them with whom?
With an impresario, a business leader, about 2 months prior.
And the significance, according to the source, was that these were notes from Galípolo, not
necessarily from Haddad or the finance ministry. The source emphasizes this to suggest Lula might be seeking economic input directly from the central bank president, maybe bypassing his finance minister sometimes.
Interesting. And the source also commented on how this kind of detail leaks out in Brasilia.
Yeah, they sort of framed it as part of the city's gossip club, how information about these private meetings tends to surface.
Sounds familiar for political capitals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and on that IOF issue, the potential tax hike, did this source offer a theory about Lula's strategy?
It did put forward a possibility. The suggestion was that maybe Lula initially gave the IOF hike idea a green light. But then, when it apparently faced some pushback or criticism,
He distanced himself.
the theory is he might have strategically backed away, essentially letting Haddad take the heat for it.
So the source is interpreting it as Lula maybe positioning it like it wasn't really his main idea, leaving his minister to handle the negative reaction.
That's the interpretation presented in the source material, yes.
Okay, so building on this picture of alleged internal tensions, the source then brings in the legislative angle. Hugo Motta, the guy who hosted the barbecue.
And head of the Chamber of Deputies, yeah. He made a statement to the press after that barbecue event.
And his statement is included in the source material. What did he say?
Well, the source presents it as containing some pretty specific criticisms of the government's approach to raising revenue.
How so?
He apparently described these sort of piecemeal tax increases as a makeshift solution. The source notes he used the Portuguese word gambiarra.
Which implies like a temporary fix, not a real solution.
Exactly, something improvised. And according to the source, he also questioned the legality of using certain taxes this way, like that potential IOF increase we discussed.
And his main argument was
That this whole approach creates instability, insecurity, makes investors nervous.
which isn't good for the economy. Did he propose an alternative, according to the source?
He did. He called for the government to shift focus. Instead of just looking for more taxes whenever spending goes up or revenue dips,
They should do what instead?
he argued they need to concentrate on structural reforms and, crucially, a review of government spending. He used the phrase reviewing expenses.
So basically tighten the belt instead of just raising taxes, that classic fiscal debate.
Precisely. Increase revenue versus control expenditure. And Motta's stance, as reported, clearly favors the expenditure control side.
And the source mentioned he said something about the chamber's cooperation.
Yeah, he apparently made a point that the chamber has actually been pretty consistent in approving measures the government sends over, indicating they're willing to work together.
Yeah.
But, he stated, they haven't received measures focused on reviewing government spending. And he reportedly emphasized that this view, the legislature's desire to see spending reviewed, had been clearly communicated directly to Minister Haddad.
So according to the source, you've got the head of the legislature publicly pushing back against the fiscal strategy associated with the finance minister, saying we need a different approach.
That's the situation presented, yes. A clear call for focusing on the spending side of the equation.
Okay, so after all this narrative laid out in the sources about alleged undermining, being left out of meetings, legislative criticism, the material ends with a clip of Haddad himself, right?
Yeah, Fernando Haddad speaking publicly.
And specifically talking about President Lula.
That's right, and the source zeroes in on the praise he gives Lula.
What did he say?
Quoting Haddad directly from the clip, he stated that President Lula brings emotional stability to the country.
Emotional stability.
Through the way he treats and respects people, according to Haddad's statement in the clip.
Okay, and how does the source, the commentator, react to that, especially after everything else they've presented?
Well, this is where their commentary gets quite sharp. Given the context they've built up, the alleged undermining, the exclusion, they view Haddad's statement as potentially absurd, or they interpret it as a sign of Haddad's unwavering loyalty, maybe even subservience, despite the circumstances they've described.
So the source really frames it as a stark contrast. You have the minister publicly praising the president's character and stability, while, according to the source's narrative, there's all this potential internal tension and political maneuvering going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. It creates this notable juxtaposition from the perspective of this particular commentator, making you think about the different layers of political interaction.
Right. So let's try and tie this together for you, the listener. We've journeyed through this narrative presented in the source material.
Yeah, looking at the alleged political games around that potential IOF tax hike.
The apparent preference shown by the president for Gabriel Galípolo over his finance minister, Haddad, at least according to the source's interpretation of events like that barbecue.
Then there was the pushback from the legislature, from Hugo Motta, calling for a different fiscal path, focusing on spending review, not just tax increases.
And finally, that really striking contrast, as the source frames it, between Haddad's public declaration of loyalty and praise for Lula.
And the perceived internal friction and undermining that the source suggests might be happening.
Understanding these kinds of behind-the-scenes interactions, or at least the reported interactions and interpretations from sources like this and the different policy viewpoints, it's pretty crucial, isn't it, for making sense of where the government might be heading policy-wise?
Absolutely, and the potential challenges they could face. It really highlights from this viewpoint the complex dance between political relationships, economic strategy debates, and, the realities of legislative power.
It really does. So maybe a final thought for you to consider, based on all this from the sources. You have these competing ideas about fiscal policy, hike taxes, or review spending. And you have these reported internal power dynamics. What does this specific narrative suggest about the challenges the government faces in finding a truly stable economic path forward, balancing all these different pressures and priorities?
It's definitely something worth thinking about as things continue to unfold.